This evening, Dr. Peter Hodum will present part 2 of this two-part class on seabird identification. Part 1 was presented in December last year and covered ducks, geese, loons, grebes, and cormorants. The recording of that class can be found online on the PSBO website. I've included links to that page in a few of our emails already that we've had over the last month or so. And I'll also include that link in future emails as well. This recording will also be on that same site, on the same page. Part 2 of the class this evening will cover the gulls, those pesky gulls, terns, and alcids, the species that are regularly seen in our region. But before we move on, I obviously want to thank you all so very much for taking part in the program this year. As I said before, this program is completely impossible without all of your help. Whether you're new this year, whether these are the first few surveys, your first ever February survey, or whether you're a veteran and been doing this for many years. Thank you so very much. It's really important that we keep this study going. And like I've already mentioned earlier, this data is being used right now by researchers at the University of Washington. And so, yes, all of your efforts are being put to use as we speak. So thank you. I'm going to read a short biography of Peter, our class teacher tonight. Peter is a professor at the University of Puget Sound, teaching a variety of courses in both the biology and environmental policy and decision-making programs, including conservation biology, ornithology, and biodiversity. Peter's been an advisor to the PSSS program since its inception in 2008 and has volunteered for all 16 years of the program. Peter conducts research on avian ecology and conservation biology and is particularly interested in the impacts of threats to birds like marine plastic debris, habitat alteration, introduced species, and bird populations and island ecosystems. For example, in the Pacific Northwest, he's studying the ecology, population dynamics, and conservation status of burrowing seabirds, principally rhinoceros auklets and tufted puffins. Okay, so little logistics. If you want to ask questions, please use the chat function at the bottom of the screen. You'll see it's like a little bubble and has chat written on it. So if you just click on that, a little side panel will come up and then you can type in your question. I will moderate the questions as the classes are going. If there's something that's very pertinent and I should interrupt Peter with, I will do so. Otherwise, if it's more of a longer question or a bit more of a discussion, we'll leave those to the end so that we can give them the time they need and without the needs to interrupt Peter too much. This evening will be approximately about an hour with about 17 slides. Again, this is gulls. We could talk about gulls for a long time. I'm not sure how much knowledge Peter has in all of the intricacies of, of the plumage, for age sizes and classes and all of that business. We're not going to go into that detail tonight. We're going to go into some of the main ways to tell them apart. So yeah, we'll keep it to about an hour. Hopefully that will include questions as well, but we're going to be flexible depending on how many questions folks have. Okay, and with that, I'm going to hand over to you, Peter.
Thanks, Toby. Thanks everybody for showing up on this chilly late January evening. I'm going to share my screen right now. Make sure that you can. Okay, can everybody see that? Okay. Okay, see Toby nodding his head. Great. Yeah, we're going to start off with the easy part. We're going to just start with gulls, and that shouldn't take us long because they're pretty distinctive and don't pose problems for anybody. Um, Gull identification can be a masochistic pursuit. So be gentle with yourselves. I think gulls were put on this planet in part to keep seabird folks humble. Um, so I put up this image that this is an illustration by John Muir Laws, a great naturalist and illustrator. I'm not, this is more than anything, the gestalt of this. I'm hoping as you're looking at this image, you're like, whoa, there's a lot. And there's not necessarily a lot of obvious distinctions between some of these species. And I think that, recognizing that some of these species, which include species that will hybridize freely between each other, can be very difficult to tell apart, even under favorable lighting conditions and all of that. So recognizing that and recognizing that they mature over multiple years. So it's not as though gulls have a single juvenile plumage and an adult plumage. They're like the larger gulls that we have in this region take 4 years to go from their first year plumage to full adult plumage. The intermediate sized gulls have 3 years. So you've got these gradations of plumage, which again can really complicate things, especially with the larger gulls, where if you're trying to identify an immature large gull, is it a is it a darker juvenile that suggests that it's a hybrid Western glaucous-winged, or is it just a third year glaucous-winged gull that is beginning to move more towards adult plumage? So the take home here is there's a lot going on. And some of these species are more distinctive than others. So as Toby said tonight, unless you wanted to spend 2 or 3 hard-earned discretionary hours of your time going through exquisite detail of the differences between these species, we're going to keep it at a level that I'm hoping is practical, and also encourage you to feel comfortable saying at times, I'm not sure what that is. And it's okay when you're recording that in our observations to put it as a large gull species. If you really are not confident, we would much rather have that than someone feeling pressure to say, well, I'm not sure, is that a glaucous wing Western hybrid, or is that a pure glaucous wing gull? If you're not confident, it's better to be conservative, because that uncertainty is not reflected in the record that you record. So another way to look at gull ID is here. I really like this image. Gull, 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 not gull. And some of you, again, you have the ability to distinguish between many of the species of gulls that we typically see in this region. And others, welcome to, again, what can be a daunting part of seabird identification. So I'm going to start off with images of what are generally considered to be purebred glaucous-winged gulls. I say that with some hesitation because we live in a zone that is kind of a transitional zone between Western gulls, which are to the south of us, more in Southern Oregon and California, and glaucous and glaucous-winged gulls, which extend down here, but the center of their distribution is much more up into British Columbia and a bit farther north. So we're in a zone of overlap between the two species, and they do interbreed, and they interbreed freely. And so in the Salish Sea, we definitely have more of an influence of the glaucous-winged gulls than Westerns, but we also see birds that are clearly hybrids. The challenge is, unless you have the genetics, you may have an individual that's back crossed and is genetically speaking a hybrid, but in terms of its plumage, looks very much like a glaucous-winged gull because maybe it's 1/16th Western. Um, and so recognizing that, functionally speaking, an individual like that is going to look indistinguishable from a pure glaucous-winged gull. But these are kind of our quintessential larger gulls in the area. The adult, like in this upper right here, this is taken on Protection Island. You have the gray, even gray mantle, silvery gray. The primaries are also pretty consistent color, grayish color with the mantle. So you don't see noticeable darkening in the tips of the primaries. This one here, there may be a hint of Western in it. You can see a little bit of darkening in the primaries relative to the mantle. But even with that, there's some variability in terms of just the amount of grayness or the darkness of the gray in those primaries, even amongst pure glaucous-winged gulls. And then we have this looks like a second-year glaucous-winged gull down in the lower part here, trying to swallow a sea star. So glaucous-winged gulls, they're year-round. They've got the heavy yellow bill. During the breeding season, they have a clear white head. They have the reddish spot on the bill. Juveniles, that's less, it's lacking. The bill color is also a darker color in the juveniles. And then you'll see birds that are like subadult going into winter, and they may develop a darker head, like this individual with the kelp crab. If you were to do a transect starting from the inner waters of Puget Sound out along the Strait of Juan de Fuca, and then hang a left and go down the coast south, you will see an increase in the darkness of the gulls. You'll see an increase in frequency of hybridized birds, and it's shown very clearly in the plumage of these birds. So this is a pair from Tatoosh Island, so right on the tip of Cape Flattery, a bit darker across the mantle. You can see on the one on the right more clearly, there's a darkening of the primaries here. The heads look the same. If you were to look just at the head and above, you'd say they're indistinguishable. They're white-bodied birds, white-bodied gulls with that heavy yellowish bill, the red spot on the bill, the gonus. If you look down here on the lower left, you can see a bird that is clearly a hybrid. Darker mantle. I'm just going to go back a slide. You can see the mantle is a much paler gray and much more even gray again across the primaries. We go back here, you can see darker primaries, much darker here. The bird in that lower left corner has a pretty heavy Western gull influence to it. So these birds are also around year round, and you'll see them increasingly frequently as you move out towards the outer coast and then head south. And at some point you get into like Northern California, Southern Oregon, you are into pure Western gull distribution, and you don't really see the hybrids. So recognizing that these birds are hybridized at all sorts of degrees, it's not necessarily a 50-50, a glaucous-winged and a Western. It could be a hybrid that has a variable amount of glaucous-winged genetics breeding with another hybrid with some indeterminate amount of hybridization, producing offspring. And that's where it can be really hard to distinguish between them. You'll see the term Olympic gull used. It's not been, to my knowledge at least, it hasn't been officially adopted, but kind of by taxonomic committees, by the American Ornithological Society. but it's used kind of colloquially, locally to reference these hybrids. Um, so they're the biggest gulls we're going to see in the area. And again, the idea behind these two talks that I'm giving is not to be comprehensive. We're not going through every gull species that we see in these waters, but rather the ones that we're most likely to encounter. So we do get Thayer's gulls here. We do get glaucous gulls. We occasionally get herring gulls. But they're few enough and far enough in between that we really didn't want to distract from the core group of gulls that you're most likely to see on a regular basis. Okay. So moving on to ring-billed gulls, we do see them year-round. They do generally clear out during the summer months because they move typically into freshwater systems to breed, but there are populations that hang around year-round, but they're certainly present throughout the wintering period. And these are in the small, mid to small gull size, much finer, white-bodied again, pale gray mantle. They have black primaries with these little white spots on them, so it almost looks like a ladder. Yellowish legs, and then they have a yellow bill. And one of the things to look at with gulls in general is the size of the bill relative to the head. So does the bill look heavy relative to the head? Does it look fine? Does it look pointed? In the case of ring-billed gulls, the bill is much finer relative to the head than we see in glaucous wing gulls. These have a pretty heavy, significant bill. And this has a lot to do with what they feed on. These glaucous winged and glaucous winged hybrids are very opportunistic. They'll eat a wide variety of prey, including scavenging, carcasses and so forth. And the bill reflects that. Ring-billed gulls tend to be a little bit more specialized in their diet. They aren't scavengers to nearly the same degree. They tend to grab fish, crustaceans, and so forth. And the bill is, again, finer. It's not that heavy, general all-purpose bill. And if you see them in decent light, you'll see that the yellow bill has that black ring, which is the reason why they're called ring-billed gulls. Lovely birds. They fly a little bit more buoyantly than the larger bodied gulls, the glaucous winged and the glaucous winged western hybrids. So we have ring-billed gulls. We have California gulls, which are similarly sized, although a little bit bigger than ring-billed gulls. We tend to see them coming into our system. They are around in small numbers year-round, but generally they're breeding at this time of year down in the Gulf of California and the Pacific coast of Baja California. So they come up here during their non-breeding season, our summer. So arriving typically in May through November is when they're kind of here in predictable numbers. Yellowish legs again. Here's a near adult in the lower right. The legs are a bit paler. They're kind of pinkish yellowish, but full adults have yellow legs, like the ring-billed gull. They have a gray mantle and coverts. Excuse me. They also have those black primaries with those white spots on them. Again, similar to ring-billed gulls. These birds are a little bit larger, and they don't have the ring. Instead of the ring, they have a black tip and then the red spot on the lower mandible. So that's, if you get a good look at the head, those are really nice features to distinguish. If you don't have a size comparison, you're like, I know that California gulls are a little bigger than ring-billed gulls, but you don't have a size comparison, maybe that's not going to help you. But if you get a decent look at the bill, you'll see that. And I'll just go back again. The bill is also a little bit heavier in the California gull relative to the head size. And it's a brighter yellow, it's more of a yellowish orange, whereas the ring-billed gull, it's almost like a washed out yellow color. with that black ring. So you get that really nice contrasting red and then that black terminal tip on the bill in the California gull. So California gulls, ring-billed gulls. Kierman's gulls are they are actually relatively easy to distinguish. I just have two pictures. I should have included an adult. Sorry, these are both. Well, this one is an adult, but outside of breeding plumage. We see them come in again. They are a Mexican breeding bird in the Gulf of California primarily. So they breed now. They finish breeding. They migrate up here and come into our system May, June, and then hang around until they migrate back south again in late fall. But they've got that reddish, that really bright red bill, a black tip on it, gray. Their markings are distinctive. You're unlikely to mistake a Heermann's gull for any other gull. And they do come in, they're quite abundant on the outer coast during the summer months. But we also see them pretty consistently in outer Puget Sound, at least. So we've got Heermann's gulls. Mew gulls Mew is the old name, so many of you may still be thinking of them as mew gulls. They were renamed just within the last few years. They're now called short-billed gulls. Similarly sized to ring-billed gulls. They have quite a fine bill. In the upper left, you can see a full adult, yellowish legs, in contrast with the juveniles. So you can see a juvenile is the bottom picture, and then a second-year bird about to go into the third-year adult plumage, perched on the no swimming sign in the upper right. So you can see the legs are transitional. They go from a pale pinkish leg to a yellowish pink to a full yellow in the adult. The adult has a yellow bill. Again, fine bill relative to the head. These are not opportunistic scavengers. These are birds that are really specializing on zooplankton and small fish right up at the surface. And the bill is an adaptation to that sort of more specialized feeding. And these are widespread and abundant throughout the Sound and out into the Strait of Juan de Fuca and throughout our survey period. Lovely small gulls. And then I think this is the last gull that I wanted to mention is Bonaparte's gull. These are gorgeous gulls. If you're in a place where you get to see them, they do spend a fair bit of. We have some nice populations down here in the South Sound, in the Tacoma, in and around the Tacoma Narrows, and some of the passages around here. In the upper right is a breeding bird, so you may see some of these early in the season. So they migrate in from freshwater systems in late summer. And you may see some birds in this breeding plumage before they molt out. You'll also see some of the late leavers, the ones that are departing right at the tail end, migrating out late in the season, may have molted into breeding plumage with the black head, the little white crescent, partial circle around the eye, clear white nape of the neck and breast, pale gray across the mantle. They have these lovely, I show this bird in the lower panel in flight because they have the outer primaries are white, and then you see the black wingtips on the outer 4 or 5 primaries. So in flight, they have a really distinctive, markings, and you can see on the underside, you can see that black trailing edge of the wing. They also fly in a very buoyant way. They almost fly like terns, much more so than what we think of as a typical gull flight. And another thing to notice about them, and then so these two birds, the one in the upper left and then the lower panel, are both in winter plumage. So they lose the black head. The amount of black on the head is variable, but it goes a lot paler. Some of them will look almost white-headed with these black kind of ear patches, or about where the ears are. One thing to notice is the black bill and how fine that bill is. It is an extreme, amongst the gulls, this is one of the more extreme examples of a fine bill. These birds are foraging mainly on zooplankton. So these bills are almost like pincers. They're quite precise. They're grabbing small prey, frequently around eddy lines and convergence areas, where you get concentrations of planktonic prey. And the bill again reflects the utility. But at all stages, they have that the bill is black and it is very fine, almost pincer-like. So the final larid, so the family that we're talking about is the Laridae. The final larid that I'm going to mention tonight is a Caspian tern. They're not typically in our system, in kind of the Salish Sea system during our primary survey months. Occasionally you'll see them coming in at the tail end or right at the beginning. You may get some stragglers that haven't migrated out yet in the October surveys, depending on where your survey sites are. These are the size of mid-sized gulls, so they're not, they're the largest terns that we have by far in North America. They fly more like gulls. They are size-wise, they're gull, kind of mid-sized gull, not glaucous-winged gull, but more like a California gull size. They've got the black wingtips, the black cap, the clean reddish bill, which is fairly heavy, but it comes to a point. It's not hooked, like you see in like the larger gulls. And they do breed in our region, not necessarily all that successfully. They've struggled with loss of breeding habitat. They've been displaced from the Columbia River system because they do prey on salmon. So they've kind of been persecuted and kind of displaced from a lot of their breeding, including in the potholes area. A species that beautiful species, and I think underappreciated. So Caspian terns are the last larid that and then we've got the Jaegers and skuas. The one that we see most commonly in here, and we can see Pomeran, we can see long-tailed Jaegers, we can see skuas, but by far the most common one that we see kind of in our survey region is the parasitic Jaeger. So it's the size of a large gull. They fly pretty directly. They fly similarly to a gull. But if you see a gull-like bird pursuing other marine birds, have a good look at it, because parasitic Jaegers are part of the way that they feed is through what's called kleptoparasitism, which is parasitizing or stealing food from other birds. And they are very good at it. All of the Jaegers do this to a greater or lesser degree. But in terms of identification, they have this brownish cap, the whitish collar, and then kind of fairly uniform brown with a little bit of variation in the color of the brown across the back, across the wings. When the tail is fanned out, it's rounded, and then you have these two central tail feathers that extend out. When the tail is not extended, when they don't have it flared, you see on the right in this immature bird, the tail is narrow, and those two modified central tail feathers merge, and it looks like it's a single point. So it's rounded, but then you have this point, and that's a pretty diagnostic feature, along with some of the markings on the head. With the immatures, you get more mottling. It's less clean across the breast. You get this stippled brown across the breast. And the bill is it is hooked. It's darkish, grayish brown, depending on whether you're looking at an adult or a juvenile. Excuse me. So if you do see a Jaeger, look closely. The odds are that it's going to be parasitic, but we do get all of them. So it's worth, if you can get a good look at it, do so looking at the markings around the head, looking at the tail shape, the modified central rectrices or tail feathers. They are differently shaped in the different species. And I'm not going to go into the details of that here. But if you're interested in seeing what the others look like, you can pull out your bird guide and you can look. But those central tail feathers can really help you identify between Jaegers. Okay, moving on to Alcids. The most common that we see in our survey region, rhinoceros auklets, certainly more abundant during the summer months. Because we have a large breeding colony on Protection Island. We have another significant, but certainly smaller one on Smith Island. And, we're talking about many tens of thousands of rhinoceros auklets in the Salish Sea system during the summer breeding season. Many of those birds migrate out of the Salish Sea and out onto the Pacific coast for the winter, but we do get them year round. And so we see them down here in the South Sound, year round in small numbers. During the breeding season, you see they've got this, they're a grayish looking bird. Sit fairly low in the water, fairly heavy head. During the breeding season, they have a heavier bill. They shed some of the plates of that bill in the winter. But this orange bill with the horn, which is why they're called rhinoceros, because of that horn. They lose that horn in the non-breeding season, and the bill gets reduced in size. So this is really just for the breeding season, for display purposes. And then they also have these modified phyloplume feathers, so that it looks like they've got these white eyebrows, little tufts here, and then a mustache. It looks like a little white mustache on them. During the winter season, they'll look like juveniles. So juveniles and adults will look more like this. So the bill is greatly reduced in size. You lose the horn, you lose the plumes, so they look like a fairly drab grayish brown bird. These are all wing-propelled divers. So if you watch them dive, the way they enter and the way they dive is significantly and noticeably different and distinct from foot-propelled divers like grebes and loons and waterfowl. So those birds typically launch themselves. They build a little bit of momentum by pushing off with their feet to engage and generate momentum as they begin the dive. Whereas wing-propelled divers, like all of the Alcids, all of the birds in this family, they simply lean forward and engage the leading edge of their wings and flick and disappear underwater. So they enter the water much more unobtrusively. It's a subtler way of entering the water. So rhinoceros auklets we have year-round. Pigeon guillemots, pretty ubiquitous year-round. Again, some move out of the system or will shift out of kind of the Puget Sound area and out into the Strait of Juan de Fuca, but we have them year-round in good numbers. The left image is an adult, an adult in breeding plumage, pretty unmistakable, black body, white, prominent white patches on the wings, black bill. If you see them open the bill, they have a red lining to the mouth, same color as their feet, this bright red color. And then they'll go into a winter plumage, which looks like the juvenile plumage. And there's I have a couple of images here on the right side just to show the variability in the winter plumage. So the bird in the lower right, it's in full winter plumage for that bird as an individual. And you can see it still retains a lot of black and the really prominent white wing patch, whereas the bird in the upper right has lost a lot more of the black across the back. It's a lot more mottled, and that white wing patch is not nearly as pronounced. But they have a fairly thick neck. And I mentioned some of these distinctions because the winter plumages can be a little bit trickier, especially if you're in an area where you're possibly seeing marbled murrelets in winter plumage. So pigeon guillemots are bigger, they're more heavily bodied, they have a thicker neck. The bill relative to the head is a lot heavier. It's a longer bill relative to the head, and it's a thicker, heavier bill compared to marbled murrelets. We also get common murres, primarily in the kind of late summer to late winter period. The left side shows murres in breeding plumage, this image. So dark head, they've got, if you get them in good light, they have that little diagonal line coming back from the eye. Kind of a chisel-shaped bill, dark bill. They're kind of chocolate brown, blackish colored, um, blackish brown across to the tail, and then they've got some mottling and stippling of that darker color dropping below that clean break. But they have a white breast, white rump area, short tail. When they go into winter plumage, again, it can be variable. This is the bird up in the upper right is a juvenile, pretty clean white face with this dark streak coming down from the eye, little bit of a dark cap. You can see that the bill is shorter and less heavy relative to what it looks like in an adult. And then in the lower right, that's an adult bird that's in winter plumage. The winter plumage, again, they're drabber. There's not, the white is less clean. They don't have that clean dark head. It starts to get into mottling and stippling. But they are, throughout Puget Sound and into the Strait of Juan de Fuca throughout our survey period. Marbled murrelets, these wonderful little mysterious birds. So these are quite small. Again, size, once you start to get reference points, it gets helpful. Size, if you're relatively new to this, may not be all that helpful, but try to use frames of reference. Like if you happen to see other bird species around when you see the murrelet, you can reference it. Is it smaller than the guillemot that you're seeing? Is it smaller than, the bufflehead, whatever? But try to reference things that you can then compare to. The left image is a bird in breeding plumage. They have that white rump, which again is really distinctive. If you get a view of their rump in even half decent light, they have that short, stumpy tail, and the white rump is quite distinctive. And then they have this, they may look drab and brown until you see them in good light. And then you start to see the subtle shades of brown that comprise their plumage, including on the breast. And the breast is where they get the name marbled because it is this mottled brown and white intermixed. Looks primarily brown when you see it in good light, and you can see just a little bit of that in this image of the bird on the left. Look at how small the bill is relative to the head. So I'm just going to go back. If you're going to confuse marbled murrelets with anything, it's likely to be pigeon guillemots. Look at how much larger and heavier and longer the bill is in a pigeon guillemot relative to the head. So this is just internal comparisons. You don't need anything else. So fix that in your mind. That bill is about 2/3 the length of the width of the head, if you were to take like the base of the bill to the back of the head, the bill is about 2/3 the length of that. And it's about a third or a quarter of the thickness of the depth of the head, if you think about it quantitatively. Whereas this bill is maybe a fifth, a sixth the length of the head, and it's small. It's got that curved upper mandible, as opposed to a straighter mandible, the more linear form to the bill of like a pigeon guillemot. And then on the right, we have a really nice photo of a bird in winter plumage. So they become a lot whiter. They become grayer. So you don't see as much, that rich brown that you see in the breeding plumage. They still have that short tail, little stubby tail with the white butt. But that marbling largely disappears, and you get much more white looking bird across the throat and the breast. And then you get that white cheek patch as well, and white above the upper mandible too, so just in front of the eye. So pretty different looking plumage in the winter season, but that combination of the shape of the bird, it has a fairly slim neck, a fairly small head, small overall, that cute little stubby tail, the white butt, and then that small bill, really fine bill, those are going to be diagnostic ID tools. So here we have a pigeon guillemot in winter plumage, in the upper left, a marbled murrelet in the upper right, and a common murre in the bottom. And again, looking at bill size, the pattern of darkness, the heaviness of the bill or the fineness of the bill, all of these things, looking at things like in the pigeon guillemot in this upper left picture, you can still see a fair bit of that white patch on the wing. There's always some of that white patch. Marbled murrelets don't have a white wing patch at any stage of their plumage cycle. Common murres don't have a white wing patch on any stage of their annual plumage cycle. So you can use a suite of different kind of cues when you get into ambiguous plumages. Like, what is that bird that's 300, 400 meters out? Conditions aren't great. Try to use a few different reference points to hone in on the species that you're seeing. And I'll mention ancient murrelets, which we do see in winter in the Salish Sea. Although I should say that even in the summer, this picture that the upper left picture, I took that of a breeding pair with their two chicks inside of Protection Island. So they do make it in small numbers, even during the summer breeding season. But what you're more likely to see, and it depends on where you are, ancient murrelets are much more localized in terms of where you're likely to see them in the winter. We just don't get them down here in the South Sound. You're more likely to see them up around the San Juans, Point No Point, in those areas. Use Admiralty Inlet and those areas around Whidbey sometimes can be really good locations to see ancient murrelets. Small bill again, gray across the back. And then they have the dark collar, almost black, and then the black head. Even in the winter, it's reduced relative to the summer. And then they have that pale bill. So they have a fine bill. It's a differently shaped bill to that of the marbled murrelet. But again, the plumages and the form of the bird, if you look at the shape of these birds, they look like they almost have no neck. They're very chunky. And so if you look at that posture as they're swimming, they tend to keep their head down low. The neck is they don't really extend a neck out as pronounced as, like, you can see this marbled murrelet in the upper right. that's not an uncommon posture with the bird fairly erect and upright, the wing tips up, and the neck is obvious. Whereas, some of the ancient murrelets in a lot of the postures, you see them as they're swimming, they almost look like linebackers, in football, where there's just no neck. It's all shoulders. And so for those of you, I'm not a football fan, but I know enough to know like that to me it makes me think of a thick-necked American football player. Um, so ancient murrelets are also in the system again, patchily distributed. Um, and with that, easy, right? We just covered gulls, we covered alcids, um, we covered Jaegers, and hopefully, if you've got questions, what I'll do is stop sharing so that I can see folks more easily. Um, and I'm happy to try to answer questions that you might have.
Thank you, Peter. There were no questions in the comments, so I think you've obviously answered everyone's questions as you've been going through, so nobody has any questions.
Great. Well, I may then, contact all of you with my gull questions.
Um, is it true? I've heard, I haven't seen many ancient murrelets, but when they're flying and they come into land, I've heard that they dive instantly. Is that right?
I see that commonly. I don't see a ton of ancient murrelets, and we don't get them down here in the South Sound. So um, I see them fairly sporadically.
Yeah. Okay.
Alcids will frequently do that, depending on especially the smaller alcids. Like I'll see Cassin's auklets do that on the outer coast a fair bit too. They come in and they land and they immediately go subsurface. Not for like a pronounced dive, but sometimes just to, I don't know what they're doing. If I assume there's some sort of adaptive value. Maybe they're looking for predators, under the surface really quickly before they settle on the surface. But I have definitely seen that with ancient murrelets. I just haven't seen them enough to say with confidence that they always do it, or they mostly do it, or they occasionally do it. Great. I don't know if everybody sees that in the chat, but Elaine posted that March 3rd, Matt Farr and Toby Ross, our very own Toby Ross, and Matt Farr is a postdoc at University of Washington, who's been collaborating with us on some projects. Will be the Washington Ornithological Society featured speakers, 7:30 p.m. Counting seabirds. How difficult could it be? Which is that's a loaded question. It's akin to you got all that gull ID, but it's the focus of which will be PSSS data.
That's right. Yeah, I'll be doing a little intro to PSSS, which you guys all know about, but then Matt will be discussing his research that he's been doing. So if you guys are intrigued on his progress and what he's doing, that'll be a great presentation for you guys to watch. Do you have another
Yes, and I see
question?
Heidi. Yeah, so they are what I tried to do. I mean the months um, that's an exercise in futility, putting the months, because birds show up when they want. What I was trying to do was capture the times when kind of the in our principal survey area when you're most likely to see those birds on a consistent basis. Living in Port Angeles, absolutely, you're more likely to see common murres year round, and on a consistent basis than we do here, say in Puget Sound proper. Yeah. So please, for all of you, please, those months are intended to be general guidelines, but please don't take them as wait. Peter sheds, they're there March through November, and I saw one in December, I must be wrong. No, 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 not at all. So believe what you see. Those are just to give you a sense of like when we most consistently see them and predictably see them in kind of our core area. Yeah, thanks for asking that question, Heidi. I think that's an important clarifying response I needed to provide.
Feel free to raise your hand if you would like to, rather than writing out. But yeah, if there's nothing else, then we can stick to our
That's right, Michael. Birds, they do their own thing. Um, they don't read the books. They don't look at the distribution maps that we painstakingly create, which is kind of part of the fun of it. Um, Merlets and pigeon guillemots. Yes, thank you, Sue. I appreciate that question because that is also another helpful distinguishing feature, especially if you're seeing them in flight, where you may well not get much in the way of those nice plumage characteristics. So pigeon guillemots, when they fly, so all Alcids fly. They're what are called very heavily wing loaded. And if you allow me to nerd out for a moment, I'll give you a little bit of an explanation for that. So that family of Alcids, so puffins, murres, auklets, merlets, etc. Um, they're basically in this really interesting tension evolutionarily because they fly and they are wing propelled divers. Um, and those are in tension with one another because if you want to be a highly efficient flying bird, those characteristics and traits of wing shape and body weight relative to wing shape and size and all of those sorts of physical characteristics are inconsistent with efficient wing propelled diving. And the converse is true. If you think about what makes a great diving bird, those characteristics are largely inconsistent with efficient flight. So they're actually proficient flyers, but it's costly flight, and they're very good divers. But what that means for their flight is that if you watch Alcids in flight, to me, it always strikes me as they're desperately trying to not fall out of the sky. And if you ever see an Alcid soaring, you know you're basically in hurricane conditions because they have very heavy bodies and they have relatively small wings, both of which are trade-offs. And those trade-offs are favoring efficient diving at the expense of really efficient flight. So I mention that because for all of these Alcids, if you see them in flight, they are going to be flying very rapidly, typically pretty low to the water, and their wings are going to be blurs, of really rapid, consistent flapping flight. They're not bounding flight, they're not soaring, etc. It is sustained flapping flight. Having said that, there are different ways that they do that and how they appear. So pigeon guillemots, when they fly, tend to fly fairly directly and steadily. If you watch marbled merlets in flight, they fly directly but are more erratically, and so they tend to bank back and forth more as they're in flight. So if you see a small, especially during the summer months, a small dark bird that's flying relatively low, sustained flapping flight, and it's kind of banking back and forth as it's flying, that's very likely to be a marbled merlet, even if you can't make a size comparison. Whereas a pigeon guillemot will be, it's not that they don't bank, but they tend to be more direct in their flight, and more even in their flight. So they don't bank nearly as much, and certainly not with the speed and the frequency of merlets.
That's very interesting, Peter. Thank you. I learned something there for sure. Any more questions from anyone? Yes, I hope this was helpful for you all. Like I said, part one of the class is already up on the website, so you guys can go and review that. Again, I will send a link to that in the upcoming emails. This has been recorded, and we shall also make this available for folks to review as well. Oh, there is another question. Hey,
Yeah, I
Jen.
was just going to say, Toby, if Dick posted something with the guillemots. So black guillemots are largely an Atlantic species, although there are a couple of populations up in the Bering Sea, up in northern Alaska, off the North Slope. I have never heard of a black guillemot even down into like the Chukchi Sea. Those are all pigeon guillemots. So I think you're safe, although, you know, with birds, you never use absolutes, or that's the only absolute you use is never, because they have wings and they can wind up in crazy places. But I would say black guillemots, really, really unlikely. I don't know if there's ever been a state record. I'd have to look. Thick-billed murres, similarly, they're really an Arctic species. Who knows, you know, with climate change, how some of those distributions may shift. But certainly for the foreseeable future, it's pretty safe assumption that murres that we see in our region are going to be common murres. I have yet to see a thick-billed murre, even on the outer coast of Washington. Um, it'd be interesting to look to see if there are state records. There probably are, um, but yeah, I think good question. That's a good question. It's I would say if you're going to look closely for things, look for like eared grebes versus horned grebes, which are very rare, but you're more likely to see an eared grebe and confuse it with a horned grebe than you are to see like a black guillemot or a thick-billed murre, at least for the foreseeable future.
Jenny's asking about the gull print at the beginning of the presentation. I think I have a printed copy of it somewhere. I'm not sure if I have a digital. Do you have a digital copy of that? The gull.
Um, I think I do. I'll look for it, Toby, and if I do, I'll send it to you,
Yeah, I'll share it
and
with
we can
everyone.
distribute it. Yeah.
There's a few other bits and pieces too. Our sister project, the British Columbia Coastal Waterbird Survey, they have a few fact sheets and identification sheets and that kind of thing. And there is one on gulls. So I'll dig that out too, and I'll share that. And any other resources on a gull ID I can find. As you all know, it's not easy. So yeah, whatever I can find, I will share for sure.
Yeah, and for those of you that are feeling overwhelmed by gulls, they're overwhelming to experts. Uh, so you're not alone.
For sure, for sure. Oh, excuse me. And I should say, as Peter said at the beginning, if you're not sure on the gull, if you on your data entry, there is large gull species and there is small gull species and there is just gull species. So if you're not sort of confident, then feel free to put one or other of those. Excuse me. Yes, feel free to put those as your gull IDs in the data entry portal. So
Oh, and it looks like, Elaine, for those of you still on, and we can share this out again with the larger community. But thank you, Elaine, for putting the link there for the download of the Gull Identification Guide by John Muir Laws.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I will share that with folks as well. Okay, well, let's call it for the evening. Thank you so much, Peter, for sharing your knowledge. I'm definitely no expert on seabirds. That's why I get all you guys to go and do the surveys. And I learn something every time we have these classes and such. So yes, thank you so much, Peter, for sharing your evening with us and your expertise. And I will put this video up online so folks can review it. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. We appreciate
Surveys.
you taking the time to nerd out on seabirds with us.
Yeah, you're just missing the thunderous applause all in our little
Yeah,
homes.
I hope you'll use some of the things you learned this evening in your surveys in a couple of days.
we greatly appreciate you. And I'd say one quick thing too, if you have recommendations for additional trainings and things like that, other things that would be helpful, please let Toby and me know. We do want to continue to offer resources that, kind of enrich your own experience as a way to enhance, your experience, but also just because you're obviously curious and we're all lifelong learners. So please reach out and let us know, and we can create new resources as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, great. Thank you all, everyone. Have a good evening. And thank you, Peter.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.